Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. This first 20 minutes or so is really only to welcome everybody here and for Etel Solingen from the International Studies Association to say a few words of welcome, followed by a few words of welcome from me. So, Etel, would you please do us the honor of welcoming everybody?
Thank you very, very much. My thanks to conference organizers, Professor Karen Rassler and Colin McInnes, for their kind invitation to say a few words before the actual plenary session. It is a very great pleasure for me to welcome all participants at this joint meeting of the British International Studies Association and the International Studies Association. Together, we gather a vibrant and growing community of scholars ready to address the conference's theme of diversity in the discipline. This is indeed a great opportunity to respond together to the global challenges we're facing today. Global challenges is the subtitle of this conference, and there are many. These challenges are very much reflected also in the program, from economic crisis in the EU and worldwide to gender, security, civil society, religion, responsibility to protect, energy, health, democracy, revolution, climate change, foreign aid, peacekeeping, nuclear weapons, and yes, IR theory, among many other topics. I have read the program. ISA and BISA are very deeply intertwined in many ways. To begin with, Susan Strange and Steve Smith served as ISA presidents. Well over 200 UK scholars are members of ISA. Of ISA's 25 sections, of course, we have one dedicated to the English school. Typically, several section chairs come from British institutions. It is not surprising to find BISA colleagues on our governing council or as program chairs of our annual conferences, or indeed to read their contributions to ISA journals. Well over half of those registered participants here come from ISA. So given all this, our joint conference this week is a natural reaffirmation of the deep ties that already exist between our two associations. Now, a few words of thanks to those who made it possible for us to be here today. In addition to the conference organizers, I'd like to recognize the human rights section of ISA that worked so hard to conduct its own meeting immediately before BISA and to integrate some of its work into the Edinburgh program. Thanks also to ISA headquarters for assistance with logistics, to Inderjit Parmar, Hugh Dyer, Ruth Blakely, and Theo Farrell in the BISA leadership, to the BISA trustees for advancing the idea of this joint conference and for sticking with it through natural difficulties, to Colin McInnes and Ruth Blakely on the program, Theo Farrell for liaison work, and of course, many, many thanks to Gail Birkett, who worked tirelessly to make all of this happen. And most importantly, thanks to all of you who are here and ready to exchange, collaborate, dialogue, and yes, debate across different theoretical, methodological, epistemological, and substantive concerns and issues. It is my hope that this meeting will lead to many more opportunities to gather the BISA ISA communities and to foster fruitful collaborations. I won't take any more time from what promises to be a very stimulating plenary session with very distinguished participation. So welcome again, and let's get started, as Fareed Zakaria says.
Okay, thank you very much, Etel, for those kind words. I just want to add my own welcome to everybody here, to the conference and to Edinburgh. It has been a long time in the making. In American electoral politics today, people talk about the 1% and the 99%. We have our own version of the 1% and 99% here, this conference itself. It was 1% inspiration from our revered former chair of BISA, Stuart Croft, and 99% perspiration for a very large number of other people ever since he stepped down from there. But anyhow, we all thank you appropriately, Stuart, in the bar later on. But I do need to say also, on behalf of BISA, thanks to quite a number of people that have already been mentioned, perhaps add a little bit here and there. I mean, primarily, I think, should thank the program co-chairs, Karen Rasler and Colin McInnes, and William Thompson as well, who's been assistant program chair. They've been absolutely fantastic in developing the kind of program that Etel was talking about. And I think everybody will find it something there for everyone, and very interesting and stimulating as well. But at the very top of the ISO organization, Tom Volge from the very beginning has been very encouraging and supportive and problem-solving oriented in making this event happen, as has Dana Larson, who's the Director of Operations. So the Executive Director and the Director of Operations, who sound like a command and control military grouping, have actually led from the front in that regard. From our own side, from BISA's side, rendering great service, I'd use that word advisedly, given Ruth Blakely has been very, very important in assisting Colin McInnes in bringing the program to where it got to as well. And I know the amount of sacrifice of time and hours spent trying to get the program together and solve all those very large and small problems, which a big event like this effectively necessitates. But Sophie Harmon has also been very helpful to Ruth and others as required. And as Etel mentioned, Theo, I didn't realize Theo had any diplomatic skills, and having been embedded in Afghanistan for a while, but it appears that the military has soft power too. And Theo has been really good in managing a large number of issues which inevitably come up between two associations and the way in which we work our different ways of doing things and so on. But as Etel also said, at the very front, left and center of this operation is our Chief of Staff and Commander-in-Chief, Gail Burkett. And Gail really is the linchpin of the entire event. She has spent so much time and energy and at the center of a storm over the last 12 months, and many storms actually. And you will note how many women there are involved in the delivery of this particular event. So as ever, we should thank the Stakhanovites at the center of this event. Gail deserves a week off and possibly more, but we really do need to thank her again for the kind of efforts that she brings in and puts into everything that she does. Without her, I think my life would have been absolutely miserable for a lot longer than it already might be. Although I'm actually quite a happy person. Anyway, this is only the second joint ISA-BISA event that anybody I've met can recall. The last one was about 25 years ago in the late 80s, and yet it's one of those events between our two associations which I think the spirit of which we need to carry forward for a number of good reasons that Etel already outlined. But we can see the benefits of the cooperation and the collaborations between the two associations in this conference itself. This is the largest IR gathering in the UK for many decades. We simply cannot deliver such a large meeting by ourselves with the kind of resources that we have. So allying with a big institution like the ISA is very advantageous in creating critical mass of scholars and so on. And I think that's a really big thing for us. The other thing, of course, is the cooperation which we've asked and has been delivered between the specialist groups of ISA and the working groups of BISA, which is apparent from many of the panels and roundtables. But there's also a kind of commingling of national styles and cultures and ways of doing IR, which is particularly important, which these kinds of events bring to the fore as well. And it's for American scholars, it's a good opportunity to see British scholars in action, which may be a mixed blessing, but I do hope my BISA colleagues will behave themselves, especially as they're still at home. But the key thing is that this is a really important event in the history of BISA, and I think it will take our cooperation between BISA and ISA forward very nicely. But it's more than an Anglo-American event itself. It's a truly international event. There are dozens of scholars from dozens of countries and practitioners from many other countries who are represented here as well. And that's fitting because clearly the theme of this conference is about how IR approaches global problems. And we need as many voices from many sources as possible in order to be able to contribute some sort of relevant ways in which we can study and think about global problems. But we have global problems and we also have national problems. And if you like, you come to the UK at this time from many other countries and you find international relations as a discipline and many of our universities kind of mired in quite a number of different issues and problems and challenges and so on. IR itself is under severe pressure in the UK and no doubt elsewhere as well. And there seems to be squeezed in various ways from all sides. There are the draconian cuts in state spending for undergraduate teaching in the social sciences, arts and humanities to zero. There's the steep rise, the trebling of undergraduate tuition fees for university study. But even more than that, the replacement of the old model of funding, which gave British universities a lot of autonomy, to a kind of customer-driven model, more or less without any kind of national debate. And then from another angle, with the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, coming up in 2014, there's the issue of the new issue of impact and having to demonstrate that. And it just seems to be that IR is having to deal with, as are the other social sciences and so on, is having to deal with, is compelled to address the charge of irrelevance. The irrelevance that IR apparently exhibits in the face of budget deficits or financial crises or economic recessions. We're asked the question, what do we contribute to these kind of problems? Why should we be funded by the state? And why should anyone pay so much to study IR at our universities? And that challenge has been thrown down right across the social sciences, arts and humanities. And it's quite clear that the response is coming and is developing and is gathering some pace. And there are kind of two broad kinds of responses. There's a kind of crude and tangible response, if you like, and that is that this country earns billions of pounds annually in overseas student fees, export earnings for the country itself. Britain is still the second most favoured destination for overseas students. Clearly, we're providing very good teaching and training in international politics and that kind of thing, and our students are well-educated, well-taught, well-trained, and they're getting good jobs, making contributions in this society and in many other societies. But there are other contributions which the social sciences and arts and humanities make as well, which are much more intrinsic to the mission of the university, which we need to put forward as well. And that is the whole idea of critical thinking to challenge conventional wisdoms and orthodoxies, the capacity to conceptualize and theorize in an innovative way, to develop rigorous and independent analytical capacity, to question established norms and values and practices, and to broaden our thoughts from the local and the national, and thereby broaden our sympathies as well. And all of these are very valuable contributions too. And I think we need to bring those to broader public attention as well. So allying with the PSA in the United Kingdom, with ISA and many sister organizations around the world, I think will help us politically to make our case for the importance and significance of social sciences and of the international relations discipline itself. And this conference, I think, is a kind of living evidence of the benefits we get from collaboration, intellectually, but also in other ways. So I think we need to explore all kinds of avenues in order to strengthen our position as the kind of challenges that we face in international relations seem to increase. Anyway, but for now, all I wanted to really do was to welcome everybody here to this conference and to hope everybody has a really good time. The conference is brilliant. The program is excellent. The city is beautiful. The sunshine is out, kind of, and sometimes. And I'm certain that everybody will have a very good time. Thank you very much. Okay, I guess we go. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, BISA Awards makes 4 awards each year, and we want to very quickly give out 3 of these awards now. Tomorrow, at the relaunch of the Review of International Studies, Kim Hutchins, the new editor of the Review of International Studies, will make the award for Best Article. But the 3 awards we want to make now are for the Susan Strange Best Book Award, the Mike Nicholson Best Thesis Award, and the BISA Teaching Award. And I think it's appropriate we kick off with the Mike Nicholson Best Thesis Award.
Thank you, Theo. We're actually awarding this in absentia because the recipient was unable to join us for the conference. But her name is Dr. Jennifer Martinez. She is an incredibly worthy recipient of the prize, and I will spend just a few moments explaining why. Her dissertation for her PhD was entitled Comités de Tierra Urbana, CTUs, and the Right to the City, Urban Transformation in Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. This was based on very extensive ethnographic research in Venezuela with the urban committee's social movements, and we found this to be a strikingly original and superbly executed thesis. A lot of scholars in IR do claim to be carrying out research in a multidisciplinary way, but we found this to be an unusually clear exemplar of transcending several disciplinary boundaries, international studies, politics, sociology, critical geography, and that was very impressive in the dissertation. All of us on the panel learned a great deal from reading the thesis, and we're really looking forward to seeing Jennifer's work flourish as she progresses. I do want to note that there was very stiff competition for this prize. We read 5 or 6, 5, I think, dissertations in total, and it was a tough decision to make because of the quality of the nominations that were put forward. So I think that underlines what an achievement this is for Jennifer. I'd like to thank my colleagues who adjudicated the prize, Professor Donnelly and Professor Thea Farrell. They did this in a very timely fashion, which was a great help to get the prize awarded in time for the conference. And I think also credit should be given to Jennifer's supervisors from the University of Nottingham. Adam Morton was her main supervisor, and we all know that supervising a student to completion is a challenge, and I think they should be credited for the excellent guidance they must have given Jennifer to write such an outstanding thesis. So congratulations to Jennifer in her absence.
Thanks, Ruth. The other award, the next award is the Susan Strange Best Book Award. The panel was chaired by Jutta Weldes at the University of Bristol, and the other 2 members of the panel were Professor Chris May and Professor Hazel Smith. Unfortunately, none of the members of the panel are with us this evening, so I'm going to make that announcement. And of course, it's almost de rigueur at these events to say it was a difficult decision, we couldn't really decide, blah, blah, blah. Apparently, in this case, it was a really difficult decision, so much so that we were sort of bombarding them with emails saying, for God's sake, would you give us the award, who's won? It really was that difficult. And it was literally yesterday evening that I got the email from Jutta saying, okay, we've decided. And it's to their credit, it's not, the award is going to Dan Bretsnitz and Michael Murphy. Their book is entitled Run of the Red Queen, Government, Innovation, Globalization and Economic Growth in China, published by Yale University Press. And I understand from the email from Jutta that this is a highly original account of Chinese economic rise. And in particular, they were incredibly impressed with the quality of the empirical research that had gone into it. The analytical framing was highly persuasive. And the basic argument, which is, as I understand it, whereas previously people have emphasized China's innovative technologies as the key component to its rise, the book advances the argument that actually it's more down to the economic structures and use of second-generation technology that have powered China's economic production. And there was a final line by Jutta saying, and I also really liked the use of Alice in Wonderland. So perhaps that was the clincher. But anyway, again, the authors aren't here to receive the award. We will send it on to them. but in the usual manner, I think, a round of applause, please.
Yes, hello. My name's Stephen Curtis and I'm the chair of the BSER Teaching and Learning Subcommittee. It's my great pleasure to announce the award for the Excellence in Teaching International Relations, which this year goes to Dr. Isla Goal of Aberystwyth University, who's done some sterling work in teaching Islamic issues in the study of international relations. I'd like to thank my fellow members of the subcommittee who helped adjudicate the award, and also to my predecessor as chair, Richard Jackson, who did so much to elevate teaching and learning issues in the discipline, and so we should give our thanks to Richard, I think. In making this award, the committee said that this prize is in recognition of the innovative and reflective use of technology-enhanced teaching methods, in particular, the imaginative and highly effective use of e-portfolios and wikis, the integration of these technologies into the teaching and learning ecology of the modules greatly enhanced student involvement and participation in the course, broadened the scope for alternative and reflective forms of formative assessment and collaborative learning, and as a consequence produced enhanced learning outcomes. The committee was particularly impressed with the development journey of the teacher, who demonstrated a positive reflective attitude, real courage and determination in developing new forms of teaching and assessment within a sensitive subject area. So if we can ask Isla to come up, please, to receive the award.
So, good evening, everybody. My name's Stuart Croft, and I get to chair the third shift of tonight's entertainment for you. I think you might find that it's rather appropriate that we are sitting in Scotland in a church, a former church. Protestantism in Scotland is not particularly renowned for joyfulness, happiness, and positivity. And I have a slight feeling that the panel tonight might be sharing more challenges, problems, worries and fears than solutions. But the good news is, after everybody here on the panel has had 10 minutes to give their thoughts, we turn to you. We have an open discussion where you can bring the joy and the positive and the solution and the ways forward that we so desperately need. 10 minutes each from the really quite outstanding panel members that we have here alongside us. Colin Hay from the University of Sheffield, known to many of us. Paul Rogers from the University of Bradford, known, I think, to all BSER members for the enormous amount of work he's done for the association over many years. Beth Simmons from Harvard University, prize-winning author. Ramesh Thakur, prize winner, a person who is extremely well known in the media, a person who's made a massive contribution to that which those of us in the United Kingdom undergoing the Research Excellence Framework now know as impact, in the way in which he has translated ideas into policy action. So we're going to have 10 minutes each. We're going to start with Colin Hay. Colin is a professor of political analysis at the University of Sheffield. Previously, he was professor in Birmingham. He's enjoyed himself thoroughly in his career. He's had freebie trips over to Harvard. He's had freebie trips over to MIT. He's had fellowships even in Manchester, would you believe, of all places. He's started a variety of journals with a number of colleagues, Comparative European Politics, also British Politics, and he is now the lead editor of the journal New Political Economy. Colin's scholarship is pretty legendary. He is the winner of a whole series of prizes, including the Philip Abrahams Memorial Prize in '97, the BSER Review of International Studies Prize in 2001, UK PAC Prize 2004, WJM Mackenzie Prize 2008, Richard Rose Prize 2009. Colin, there's a little gap. Work harder. He's going to speak about the crisis. And I like the way in which Colin describes the crisis, the meta-crisis. And he's going to talk about the need to regulate how we think about globalization, how we practice globalization, to design institutions better, to be able to deliver public goods, and to think about economic performance in terms other than growth in what he describes rather alarmingly as a post-growth political economy. Colin, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very, very great pleasure to be invited to share publicly my Cassandra-like qualities with you by reflecting, if you like, on quite how bad everything seems to have gotten these days. If you weren't depressed enough when you entered the hub, I suspect you might be by the time you leave. Indeed, it strikes me that the conference organising committee might just have used a psychological profiler to select the panellists, and indeed perhaps they did. There's a danger, I think, about debates of this kind in which we, the panellists, try in effect to outdo one another in terms of how depressed we can make you feel about the severity and intractability of the horrors of the world in which we find ourselves. The danger, I think, is it turns into something like a kind of inverted balloon debate in which you, the audience, essentially turf out one by one the least unappealing pathology of our contemporary world as we present them to you in turn. If I'm honest, I've never liked balloon debates, and in present company, I'm sure to be turfed out first. But the point is that I fully expect to agree with my colleagues and to share with them their view that theirs is indeed the worst challenge the world now faces, at least for as long as they're speaking. And I get to go first too, which is probably worse. And that means that if I'm going to play this game at all, I'm going to have to cheat just a little. When I read the invitation to contribute to this panel, I did so as a political economist, feeling an almost intuitive obligation, I think, to couch my comments in terms of the crisis. But although I do want to talk about the crisis, I don't want to talk about it in quite the usual way. My subterfuge, my cheating, if you like, is to use the crisis as a means of talking about some other longer-standing global challenges. I want to suggest to you that the global financial crisis helps us to see more clearly some of what should perhaps already have been evident to us, if only we'd been willing to look in the right kind of a way. In particular, I want to suggest that the crisis might and should lead us to reconsider three things. First, how we manage what I'll call economic interdependence, more conventionally globalization. Secondly, how we conceive of and seek both to promote and provide collective public goods at a planetary level. And thirdly, how we reconceptualize and embed institutionally an alternative set of economic values, couched more in terms of sustainability than growth per se. But I want to begin very briefly with the crisis itself. We tend to refer to this simply as the global financial crisis, but it's not like most of the things we tend to call global, genuinely global. It's by no means exclusively financial, and in one sense, it's not really even a crisis. The crisis, let's continue to call it that for now, it's just simpler, I think, is not global in the same way that most of the things we call global are not global. It has a very particular, if quite familiar, geographical character, revealing a complex combination of both intra-regional and inter-regional economic interdependencies. Its diffusion is the story of contagion, and that contagion maps beautifully the highly uneven geography of what we call globalization. And the source of the contagion is, of course, not itself global at all either, but quite specifically, in my terms, Anglo-liberal, in a way that's all too easily forgotten now that attention is focused so concertedly on the Eurozone. It's an obvious point, but this was not first a crisis of the Eurozone at all, though its contagion has, of course, exposed profound and long-standing institutional pathologies at the core of the Eurozone. And that, of course, raises a more important and perhaps a more generalizable point, my first core challenge this evening. The resolution of the crisis at a transnational level needs to be thought about in terms of the management of economic interdependence, of what we tend to call globalization. It needs to be about setting parameters on acceptable globalization, such that the pathologies of, say, Anglo-liberalism and the financial interdependencies it feeds and feeds off are incapable in the future of destabilizing the entire global political economy. That, sadly, is not a conversation currently taking place in the corridors of the IMF, the World Bank, or the White House, nor perhaps even the Élysée Palace. As this suggests, although this is not in a sense a global crisis, it is a crisis that should make us think again about globalization, about the parameters of acceptable globalization and the conditions under which globalization can be allowed to proceed. In precisely the same vein, it needs to make us think again about the parameters of acceptable financialization. As I've sought to argue elsewhere, this is less a financial crisis than it is the unraveling of the entire Anglo-liberal growth model and the financial and other interdependencies on which it rested. That model has since the early 1990s been predicated on private, not public debt. Indeed, the role played in Keynesianism by public debt was played in this model by private debt. And this made credit, finance, financialization, and the securitization of assets integral to growth. It's the acceptability of that set of relationships that we now need to reassess prospectively, in a context in which, as we now know painfully well, though perhaps we should have known all along, we cannot rely on private institutions to provide collective public goods, whether domestically or internationally. Cast in such terms, it becomes so much more obvious that the proliferation of sovereign debt crises that the wider crisis has precipitated is a product not of public indebtedness per se, but of public attempts to shore up private debt. And that, of course, was made almost inevitable by the rediscovery of something else we should have known all along, namely that the state is the public good provider of last resort. When the private banking sector is no longer solvent, there is little other option than to take private into public debt. That in turn implies that in ensuring that this can never happen again, we need profoundly to rescale the parameters of acceptable financialization and financial liberty. Put simply, we cannot afford to rely again on the credit proliferation of fair weather financialization and the asset appreciation it gives rise to as the fountain of growth in the demand-generating heartlands of the global economy. In a sense, we cannot afford to subcontract responsibility for the stability of the world economy to private institutions with no conception of the collective public good. Indeed, I would argue, we have a collective global public responsibility to ensure that the health of the world economy is not conditional on the good fortune of inherently risky and unstable growth models conducted at a national level. But is this a crisis at all? As is widely noted, the term crisis has been cheapened in recent years. Everything, it seems, is a crisis these days. So surely this is, well, yes and no. It's certainly bad enough. But that, in a sense, is my point. For etymologically, crises are typically moments in which things start to get better, moments of transformation or decisive intervention. Put like that, and at the risk of revealing my Cassandra-like qualities again, this looks more like a looming catastrophe than it does a crisis per se, a catastrophic disequilibrium perhaps. That said, the daily deterioration of the health of the patient in a sense brings closer perhaps a more genuine moment of crisis, creating the opportunity for a more genuinely decisive intervention than might ever have been likely had symptom amelioration proved more effective. But what might such a decisive intervention entail? That, of course, is the extraordinarily difficult question to answer. And the advantage for me, at least, of my brief, reiterated by Stuart, was that I was asked to talk about challenges, not to provide solutions. But that won't quite do, not least because there are some things I think we can and have to strive to say at this point, some of them implicit in what I've argued thus far. The challenge, I think, is to think in a planetary way, to think about the systemic risk that we bore collectively while scarcely even acknowledging it by virtue of allowing economic interdependence, or globalization, to proceed in the manner in which it did. We need, in effect, to rein in globalization, to establish some parameters of acceptable economic interdependence, above all, acceptable financial interdependence. But I think we also need to go beyond that in at least two ways. First, we need to think about our shared economic futures in terms of a series of collectively determined global public goods. And we need to ensure that we devise and design public institutions, ideally at a global level, capable of holding to account domestic policymakers, the models of economic development they choose, and the transnational institutions regulating their behavior in terms of such public goods. Second, and more difficultly still, I'm not sure that's a word, but anyway, we need to think again about growth. This is a growth crisis more than it is a debt crisis, and as we've arguably already seen, there is no way out of it if we treat the principal pathology to be addressed as one of debt. There is, in other words, no salvation to be found in austerity. But that's not quite enough, for this is arguably not just a crisis of growth, it should perhaps also be seen as a crisis for growth. An opportunity to think again about how we gauge economic success domestically and more collectively. This is the really difficult bit, so I'll probably stop very soon. In a context of accelerating environmental degradation, we need incrementally to wean ourselves off growth. Indeed, we probably need to do it more than incrementally. In the process, we need urgently to devise a more balanced and sustainable array of genuinely global, indeed planetary collective public goods whose promotion might eventually replace the blind pursuit of economic output as the global currency of economic success. That is about as big a challenge as it is possible to imagine. It surely deserves a place in any balloon inflated by the anxieties and concerns we should have for those future generations who will have to strive to clean up the mess we seem bound to leave them. Thank you very much.
Colin, thank you very much. One of your themes, sustainability. It'll be interesting to see if our second speaker, Paul Rogers, picks up on issues of sustainability, given that one of the things that he's been doing recently is working with the Oxford Research Group on thinking about sustainable security and what that might mean. Paul Rogers is, as I said earlier, of course, extremely well known to all BESA members for the tremendous amount of work he's done with FOR in the association for a number of years. He is, as we all know, a legendary scholar, 26 books written or edited, over 100 papers translated into more than 14 different languages. Paul is another one of those individuals who works extremely hard at communicating academic ideas and academic research into wider public discourse. He writes weekly for Open Democracy. His weekly pieces in Open Democracy then go on to at least 40 different websites around the world. He is a person who engages widely with the media, as many of us will know, having seen and heard him, clocking up more than 150 interviews in many years, putting across a variety of different ideas, points, and analyses. Paul's presentation tonight is going to look at the consequences of our responses to 9/11 over the past decade, and to see what implications that will have for changing attitudes towards that described as new security challenges. Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I have to let you into a secret. The title of my PhD over 40 years ago was The Ecology of Soil-Borne Plant Pathogens, Studies in the Control of Potato Scab Disease. So I honestly don't know how I got from there to here, but I will do my best at least to contribute tonight. I may, if I may, Stuart, alter things slightly. I want to talk about what has happened since 9/11, but I want to put it in a context and spend a lot of my time on that in a way which I think will follow directly what Colin has said, and I hope will be of use tonight. A starting point, my wife and I have two grandchildren, Zoe, who is 3, and Ben, who is just a year old. Both of them could well be alive in the 22nd century, given changes in life expectancy. Late 80s, early 90s is where they will be. And in a sense, as when you have children, so when you have grandchildren, it gives you a very longer term perspective than yourselves. And I thought it would be useful to talk very briefly, not about the current crisis so much as how we've come here and how it may play out over the next 20 years or so. And in that respect, the response to 9/11 is a very specific part of this. Essentially, I think if you take quite a long view and following on directly from what Colin was saying, one could look at the past 60 years in terms of two parts, two 30-year periods. Broadly speaking, the period through to 1980 was, in world political economy terms, an era of relatively mixed economies vying with a very strong centrally planned system, broadly the Soviet bloc, and in its time, China as well. During the course of the 1970s, following the extraordinary increase in oil prices in 73, 74, remember that was a 450% increase in oil prices in just 9 months. We entered a period of stagflation, huge economic problems, and during the course of that decade, the ideology, the economic ideology that came to the fore was that the answer essentially was with a much freer market system, which developed particularly in the 1980s with Reaganomics, Thatcherism and the rest. It got a huge boost in financial terms with what we tend to forget, the Big Bang of 1986, the deregulation of the City of London, and then the way that flowed through to Germany and the United States, who really had to vie with London, which was becoming a major financial centre in terms of financial competition. And certainly there's a huge boost to this whole theme of the nature of economic governance with the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1990-91 and the rapid change to what at the time was called turbo-capitalism in Russia in the 1990s, with very damaging results for something like a decade. 50 million people going down below the poverty line, and I think a decline in the life expectancy of men of something like 10 years. It was quite extraordinary and really not hugely commented on at the time. But if you look at the overall picture, those two 30-year periods, the second 30-year period has seen economic growth like the first 30-year period, but not as much. But what has been very clear is that under the current largely deregulated system we have, it is incredibly variable. And what has happened increasingly is that worldwide division into about 20% of the population, transglobally, sharing most of the fruits of the growth, and about 80% relatively on the margins. Now, I'm using the term marginalization in terms of the majority of the human population, and I'm using a term elite, not applying to 1% to about 20%, probably including most, maybe all of us present here tonight. That division is transglobal. It isn't rich country, poor country in the way it was, but essentially it is rooted and it is getting wider. There are various figures with it in terms of household wealth. The richest 20% actually control about 90% of household wealth. In terms of income, it's about 85%. But the point is that is a trend which is growing wider. I think it's the first one as a marker for the future. The second, in a way, is the incredible improvements, welcome improvements in education, literacy and communications over the last 40 years. My first job was working in agricultural development in Uganda over 40 years ago, and the changes in any country like that between then and now in terms of the levels of education are quite startling and massively to be welcomed. But the problem is that you actually have a much greater knowledge of this mass marginalization. Hugh Standing uses the term, Guy Standing uses the term, what is it called, the precariat. That very large number of hundreds of millions of people who do not have the kind of job security or life expectancy that many people in the Western world and elites across the world normally expect. And that, I think, is part of this phenomenon. And essentially what it means is we have a situation in which, in the longer term, I'm not talking about now, next year, the year after, I'm talking about 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, this is a steady trend. And it's leading, when you have crises, such as we've had since 2008, to really quite astonishing changes and very worrying problems of social dishesion. And it's worth remembering that you tend to forget about the underlying problems that this results in across Europe, across Latin America. If you take just as one example of many, the growth of the neo-Maoist revolt, the Naxals in India, now affecting about half the states of India, very much a consequence of marginalization. Now, essentially, that, I think, is an issue which is very much to the fore. But, of course, we're now coming into an era where we have fairly clear-cut environmental limits. The anthropogenic impact on the biosphere, the global ecosystem, is now global. The first marker was the ozone depletion problem 30 years ago, which could be resolved fairly easily. Climate change is a much bigger issue, far more difficult to resolve, and it is, in a sense, accelerating and increasingly asymmetric. So it looks increasingly that the poorest sectors of humanity will suffer most. You put those together over a 20 to 30-year period, and on present trends, which is the key term, things could get very bad. They do not have to. I must say, actually, in some ways, I'm quite optimistic, but they could get very bad. I think it was put brilliantly 40 years ago by Edwin Brooks, an economic geographer, who said, what we must fear in the coming decades is, quote, a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. Now, if you look at the gated communities in many parts of the world, that really comes fairly close to home. Much of this kind of analysis will be shared at many of the military think tanks. And essentially, I think the final issue is our tendency very much to see the situation as we see it as a matter in which control must be maintained. I call it lidism, or the control paradigm, keeping the lid on things rather than going for the underlying issues, as Colin demonstrated so much on the economic side. You put that together with environmental impact, and we have very serious problems ahead, and lidism will not work. There isn't time to argue in detail, but I would suggest in many ways the response to 9/11 is an example of the control paradigm. and has led to increasing problems. And we see, interestingly, that as you draw back from the concept of boots on the ground in response to major regional crises, which may have global implications, you move into what might be called from direct control to remote control. Drones, special forces, privatization of security, and the rest. And that, I think, is the way we seem to be going on present trends, and those had to be turned around in much the manner on the economic side that Colin has just mentioned. It has, though, to go rather farther than that. We have to move into an era of greater economic equity and emancipation. And there are many examples through the recent history of the last 50, 60 years of how that can be done. I would say anybody interested in this is well advised to go back and read the original Prebisch report of 1963, which was at the start of the founding of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Towards a new trade policy for development is as interesting and relevant today as it was 49 years ago. And essentially you have many other examples where, particularly within the UN system, you have actually the kinds of thinking that have been done in the past. In some ways, I think where we are now with our discipline is that, to be very blunt about it, some of the most interesting thinking on responding to these global crises, these global problems, is actually being done in a range of different disciplines. I think work like Tim Jackson's book on prosperity without growth, Peter Victor's work at York University, that's the Canadian one, not the British one, on getting to grips with low growth or no growth economies. The work that the New Economics Foundation is doing currently in Britain, incredibly interesting work on the Great Transition, econometric modelling of the British economy with different inputs going in to see how it can adapt it, basically move it towards much greater equity and an ultra-low carbon emitting economy. I think there are huge prospects for work to be done, and I hope that IR will contribute very much to it. I have to say that one of the real problems at present is that it is not easy to do the really innovative blue skies thinking, even within the university system, not least because of all the pressures we're under, but also, frankly, because of the peer review process, which tends really to work against really new kinds of thinking. It has to be done almost in people's spare time. Yet at the same time, I'm actually quite optimistic. There have been many examples in the past where you've had major problems which have become obvious because of individual issues. The Canary phenomenon. In many ways, the Antarctic ozone hole in 1983 was the marker that something had to be done about ozone depletion. We may well find that what is called global weirding, major weather events as a prelude to climate change, may be similar markers. I'd end with one thought, or two thoughts. One is that there's a very good definition of prophecy. It's a kind of academic definition. Prophecy is suggesting the possible. And that's one of the roles for academics. And the second point is, I started off by mentioning my grandchildren. I think if they do have good, productive lives and live 70, 80, 90 years, they may look back in a world system which is relatively peaceful and stable and sustainable. If they do, then I think they will probably tend to think it was changes that people suggested and made between 2010 and 2030 which was the key time. And this is why I think it's extremely interesting, and I'm very glad to be alive at this particular point in world history. Thank you.
Paul, thanks very much indeed, and we're quite glad you're alive at the moment as well, actually. It's a huge pleasure to welcome our third speaker, Beth Simmons, Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. Beth has taught at Duke and at Berkeley, as well as at Harvard. She's had stints in the IMF and the US Institute of Peace. She's had fellowships at the Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford and at the Strauss Institute for the Advanced Study of Law and Justice at New York University. She is extremely well-renowned, of course, for the quality of her scholarship. For example, her book, Who Adjusts? Domestic Sources of Foreign Economic Policy During the Interwar Years, won the APSA 1995 Best Book Award, Best Book in Government Politics and International Relations. And more recently, her book, Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law and Domestic Politics, Cambridge University Press 2009, won 3 extraordinarily prestigious awards. The International Social Science Council's Stein-Rocken Award, the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award, and this one I need to take a deeper breath for, the American Society for International Law's Certificate of Merit for a Preeminent Contribution to Creative Scholarship. Beth, you're very welcome, and I think you're going to tell us something about the challenges of transnational crime.
Yes, I am. So thank you very much for that welcome. I was asked to speak about transnational organized crime. And I think it's probably appropriate to start by saying I don't think that we're in a world crisis of transnational crime. Crises are sudden bursts of activity that destabilize systems and subsystems potentially across the globe, and that's not where we're at with transnational crime. Transnational crime, though, has been growing pretty steadily over the last 30 years, and it got a huge boost with the geopolitical upheavals of the 1990s. And so it is an issue that is increasingly on the sort of world scene. I guess the other thing I just wanted to start by saying, has anybody here ever been to a conference on global achievements? No, I wouldn't have thought so. But I do think I really second, sort of the noting that the increase in life expectancy, not to mention reductions in poverty, at least on a global average scale, largely due to the efforts and the achievements of the Chinese, have been two of the most important achievements that I think historically that we can point to. So we're not dealing with a crisis when we're dealing with transnational organized crime, but we're dealing with something that we don't think about very systematically. And social scientists have not done enough, I think, to really have a look into the issues that transnational crime raises. I think it really does raise the question that any polity has to face, and that is how we're going to govern ourselves. What is to be forbidden and what is to be allowed, and how do we enforce rules about what's to be forbidden and what's to be allowed? So, these things about what's to be forbidden, what is criminalized, that's all figured out at most national levels already. But it hasn't been figured out in the international polity. And one of the main sort of movements over the last 10 or 15 years has been a tremendous increase in criminalizing things globally. And I think that's a really stark development. It's really obvious, and when you think about it, when you think about war crimes, and you think about egregious human rights violations, and when you think about crimes against humanity, it's pretty obvious the important contributions of international efforts and institutions like the International Criminal Court, for example, a landmark institution. But I think there's something else that's sort of going on that we're not noticing, we're not theorizing, and we're not dealing with very well right now, and that is crime in the for-profit sector. So what I'm referring to are basically the issues of how individuals take advantage of arbitrage, legal arbitrage basically, arbitrage between what's sort of criminal someplace and not criminal someplace else to make some bucks. And it's increased rapidly over time. So Colin pointed to public responses to private activities, and that is really what a lot of the effort has been in the transnational crime area, trying to respond to private activities that at least some governments, many governments, wish were not taking place. So I think it's really important to point out that without coordination, there are tremendous opportunities for arbitrage for people to engage in criminal activity from one country to the next. And so as Colin says, it's about how we manage economic interdependence. Is transnational crime a global crisis? It depends on what kind of crime you're talking about. So I just sort of pulled up a few, and I was going to have, just in case we had PowerPoint, I was going to have no words, but I was going to have a lot of nice maps to sort of give you sort of a sense of what we're talking about globally. If you pick up, for example, a global map of where flows of money laundering come and go, even New Zealand has an arrow pointing to and from. Most small islands have significant role to play in the area of money laundering. If you look up global maps of counterfeiting, for example, you will see sort of the hot spots, especially in the eastern part of the eastern edges of Europe and into the former Soviet Union. But you find counterfeiting globally, everywhere around the world. And sadly enough, if you look at maps of human trafficking, you will find the same thing. You will find that almost every country in the world has some degree of an issue with human trafficking, whether they are destination countries, as would characterize Western Europe, for example, or the United States. Whether they are transit countries, which would characterize a lot of the Eastern European periphery, or whether they are countries of origin. And when Paul refers to 80% of the marginalized people in the world, that is setting a scene, basically. That is setting the conditions by which those who can't see their way clear to any other opportunity are often found that they are exploited. They believe in incredible offers of employment in other places, and they become exploited transnationally and are trafficked across borders. This is all the result of globalization and connectedness. It really is a very global phenomenon. And there's been a flurry of activity, too. So one thing I don't think we've paid very much attention to is how are our governments really kind of responding to these sorts of issues? A lot of it is about lidism, as Paul says. So a lot of it has been a response of more law enforcement. And so if you look at, for example, the attention that an institution like the United Nations has given transnational crime over time, you can see sort of wave after wave of attention given to particular resolutions to be passed in certain areas. So drugs were the big issue. Drug trafficking was the big issue in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Human trafficking has gained a lot of momentum in the 1980s. And terrorism, of course, gained a tremendous amount of traction post 9/11. And all of these issues, including, of course, let me just put a few more on the table, corruption, trafficking in small weapons, are others, are being dealt with in a criminal law framework. And this is really a very interesting trend. What does it mean to deal with these kinds of issues in a criminal law network? So I think that's very interesting that almost many of these resolutions that the UN passes are preludes to criminalization. And I think that's really important because if you think about it, if you criminalize more stuff, what are you going to get more of? Crime, right? And interestingly enough, in some ways, and it's just a hypothesis, look, we don't know very much about this, to be honest, but in some very interesting ways, the more you criminalize, the more you get a bit of a snowball effect. So you criminalize drugs. Oh, this creates transnational drug smugglers. You criminalize weapons. Well, we can make more on the margins if we add weapons transfers. And then you criminalize human trafficking, and there's another way that that activity gets folded into the transnational crime rings. And so in some ways you're reinforcing by criminalizing more. That's just a hypothesis. I think it's an interesting idea to be explored. So it's not just the UN, it's major countries too that have tried to sort of take a pretty strong, trying to handle this issue diplomatically, legally, et cetera. Diplomatically, it seems that it's definitely been a policy concern, if not an obsession. And I was going to put up a very interesting word cloud. And the word cloud, I was going to try to make you guess where this word cloud came from. Right in the middle of it is trafficking. And then lots of small words of all kinds of things you would imagine, international poverty, growth rates, small words around in this word cloud. And I was going to ask you to guess where this word cloud came from. It turns out I can't put that up. But I'll tell you where it came from. And before I tell you where it came from, I want to assure you I did not put the word cloud together. So I did not gather the data. So I did not engage in questionable activities. Okay, so that's clear. I found an interesting word cloud put together based on WikiLeaks from the US State Department. When you look at those that are not classified, you can see the obsession with trafficking. Now, the classified ones still deal with high security issues. ICBM is in there, nuclear is in there, terrorism. But if you just look at the documents that are not classified, you can see the obsession that the United States has had with trafficking. And you can see it also in terms of legal efforts. So you've seen a lot of just the global map of the sprouting of extradition treaties. The global map of the sprouting of mutual legal assistance treaties looks like fireworks going off in the sky. They're sprouting out of the United States. They're sprouting out of Europe. And I think one very interesting issue would be to look at the nature of cooperation among states trying to deal with transnational crime. Why is this a global challenge? It is the direct result of globalization, liberalization, and the movement of goods and people increases opportunities for profiteers to indulge in all kinds of illicit behaviors. The markets are global for drugs, weapons, even artifacts. The markets are global for labor, coerced and exploited, for services, from sex to money laundering to corruption and to counterfeiting. And there are very few places in the world that are completely unaffected from these forces. But this is not to say that geography does not matter. Geography is huge when it comes to human trafficking and much less huge when it comes to money laundering, for example. So one interesting thing that I did was to sort of say, who is criminalizing human trafficking in response to what? Criminalizing in their national law. And one of the really interesting findings is that you mimic the policies of those to whom you have the most dense road connections, because everybody's afraid of the potential diversion of criminal activity from one place to another. So we need to almost figure out the geography, if you will, of criminal activity and response. It seems to me that would be a very interesting research agenda. There are several challenges. Why is it a global challenge? One is the problem of definitions. What counts as a crime? Corruption my corruption might be your social custom, for example. Weapons, should those be, small arms, should those be criminalized in terms of international trade? A lot of countries think so, not the United States. So, despite huge numbers of deaths that are due to small arms, export is still opposed. Putting limits and regulations on exports of small arms are still opposed by the United States. Interpol won't touch political crimes, which raises the entire issue of how to deal with terrorism. And few countries, of course, are interested in applying criminal laws from other polities that they disagree with their criminal goals, like adultery in Saudi Arabia. That's not going to get enforced anywhere else in the world. It's a problem of information as well. It is really hard to know the nature and dimension of the problem, and it might be dangerous to find out. It is also, I'm finding out, really difficult to find out what our governments are even doing. So this is not an area where sort of archives are sort of open. Come on in, have a look at who we cooperate with and who we don't, and where we don't have legal agreements, how we go about things. They're not that welcoming to sort of looking into these kinds of patterns. I think also that cooperation is a problem of trust in this area. Different legal systems, different human rights standards, different police systems. Do states trust each other's police systems, their justice systems, and the foreign policy issues that may be attached to some of these crime issues and crime areas? And then finally, I just want to raise the issue of, if we think about sort of strengthening a policy response here, I think we have to be extremely cognizant of right intention. That is, if we decide that criminalizing and clamping down with law enforcement is the way to go, then we have to make sure that we stick to the intention of the criminal law, because transnational crime can be a problem, but fighting it can be too. Okay, so crime fighting can be used for lots of other purposes, like strengthening anti-immigration programs, creating police states, and supporting repressive regimes. It's not always compatible with human rights, for example, and it's not always obvious that more law enforcement is better. So one possibility, and I don't have solutions here, because I think one of the main points I want to make is social scientists really haven't given transnational criminal activities and the response to them very much thought. But I wonder if one reasonable policy response would be to use criminalization as a policy, criminalization and law enforcement as a policy tool relatively sparingly when the activity is something we definitely need and want to stop, rather than using it as a sort of a first resort to handle all kinds of social problems.
Beth, thank you very much indeed. It's also an enormous pleasure to welcome our fourth speaker, Ramesh Thakur, the Director of the Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament at the Crawford School at the Australian National University. He has had an extremely distinguished career, both as a scholar but also in the policy sphere as well. Vice Rector and Senior Rector of the United Nations University and Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations from 1998 to 2007. He's taught and worked as a professor in the University of Otago in New Zealand, as head of the Peace Research Centre at the Australian National University, and the University of Waterloo in Ontario in Canada. He has been an advisor on arms control and disarmament issues to the Australian and New Zealand governments. He was the senior advisor on reforms and principal writer of the United Nations Secretary General's second reform report. But perhaps most significantly in terms of the work that he's going to be sharing with us tonight, he was a commissioner and one of the principal authors of the Responsibility to Protect in 2001. He is another extraordinarily prolific scholar, author of over 30 books and over 300 articles. And I would just like to draw your attention to one of his recent contributions, which I think is particularly important and salient in the context of the discussions we're having tonight, The People versus the State, Reflections on UN Authority, US Power, and the Responsibility to Protect, which he published last year. He's going to share with us tonight some thoughts about the standing of the Responsibility to Protect, given, as he says to me in an email, given what has happened in Libya and what is not happening in Syria. Ramesh.
Thanks, Stuart. I must say it's a pleasure to be in a conference where people know how to pronounce University of Otago correctly. It's not always the case. We gave states the monopoly over the legal use of violence domestically as a solution to the problem of mass violence domestically. We then developed norms of non-intervention as a solution to the problem of too much international intervention into internal affairs and, therefore, great international violence resulting from that as well. And then, in the last century, particularly with the League of Nations and the United Nations, we moved also to control and regulate and limit interstate international violence. In the public debate, there's too much of a belief in the United Nations as a pacifist organization. We tend to forget that its origins lie as an anti-Nazi military alliance. But over time, the United Nations also did begin to interest itself in back into domestic violence, particularly with regard to mass atrocity crimes by states. And why did that happen? Well, again, one, as we know, the nature of warfare itself changes from interstate to internal, trans-regional, armed violence across the world. Two, the nature of the state undergoes a significant transformation in reality, away from the idealized liberal conception in European Western thought of the state as a neutral arbiter, to state itself being the most prized asset with which to oppress and suppress others. And in most communist and in some developing countries, the state essentially was an internal security state, regimes ruling through terror. Moreover, the principal victims of violence with these two changes in the nature of warfare and in the nature of the state, the principal victims of violence were increasingly civilians. And developments in communications technology bring the horror of this violence against civilians into our living rooms, raising demands on governments to do something in real time to stop that. In the meantime also, our belief in and our commitments to human rights promotion and international humanitarian law gain increasing salience over the decades. And so in all that, with all those deep underlying structural changes, if you like, that in a sense responsibility to protect, and I'll use the acronym R2P, is an effort to realign the United Nations normative mandates to contemporary realities. Brought to a head in particular, if you go back in time, in 1999, with the NATO intervention in Kosovo. As a result of which, many in the policy as well as in the academic communities began to talk of a new, perhaps emerging norm of humanitarian intervention. But when Kofi Annan raised that in September 1999 in the General Assembly, all hell broke loose around him, because the developing countries reacted ferociously and challenged that whole challenge of humanitarian intervention. And the Canadian government then brought together an independent international commission to try and find some common ground between the two sides. And we came up in the midst of that bitter contestation and polemical divide with our formulation of responsibility to protect, redefining sovereignty as responsibility, locating that primarily in the states domestically, but arguing that if the state should default through incapacity, unwillingness, or through itself being the perpetrator, then the residual fallback responsibility vests in the international community, but acting through the United Nations. This was picked up in 2005 at the largest ever gatherings of heads of government and state in human history at the United Nations, and accepted in the outcome document, although with some interesting changes, where we had essentially, I guess, argued for it as an emerging global political norm. They realigned that to the existing international legal crimes of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. They raised the bar to manifestly failing in its responsibility, but they also accepted the enormous conceptual redefinition and said, yes, we agree that all states do have the responsibility to protect everyone living within them. And they said that where states fail, we will take timely and decisive action. That remains a problem. Since then, the Secretary General has published 3 special reports, and another one is due, which have sustained and consolidated the consensus on R2P. The General Assembly has had an annual debate on each of the special reports, which have developed broadly shared understandings of what this means, and developed a certain comfort level with the 3-pillar argument in terms of domestic capacity, international assistance to build capacity, and then the 3rd pillar of coercive intervention. Civil society organizations have engaged in a vigorous process of norm socialization and norm crystallization. And so by the time you come to Libya in many senses, or even at the start of this year, the principle is not under attack at the start of this year, but the manner of its implementation is being questioned. Most of you will be familiar with the details of the argument about what it means. I'm not going to go into that, but let me distill my understanding of that into 4 sentences, literally. R2P means an acknowledgement of a duty of care by all of us who live in zones of safety towards those trapped in zones of danger. It is a means of channeling individually outraged moral indignation into collective policy remedies. It's a normative instrument of choice for converting a shocked international conscience into decisive collective action. In a vacuum of responsibility for the safety and security of the marginalized, stigmatized, and dehumanized outgroups at risk of mass atrocities, it provides to the international community an entry point for taking up the moral and military slack. Which all sounds very nice, sounds very lofty. In reality, we have disputes over whether it's applicable to the victims of Cyclone Nargis in Burma, We have debates about what use is it if we can't do anything in Darfur. Gareth Evans has argued that Darfur is a failure of other approaches, not a failure of R2P. Even if we agree with both these propositions about Burma, that it was inapplicable and Darfur is a failure of others, and I do agree with both, nonetheless, it points to a continuing set of protection gaps in the existing normative architecture. So the problem, to some sense, remains. But then when you come to Libya, you do have almost a textbook set of circumstances that explain this first coercive implementation under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter of R2P. You have threats being issued by a regime that had form, that had credibility in issuing threats of the most brutal, violent nature. That threat was very imminent. We didn't really have the luxury of waiting it out. You had the Arab League, which has some claim, I think, to being the world's premier organization of tyrants. Even the Arab League says, intervene, come and do something. You had the defecting Libyan diplomats, including their ambassador to the UN. You had clamors from Britain and France. And you had an internal debate within the US administration. What was striking was how much R2P was the discourse of choice, dominant all over the world, from those countries that had, and regions that had been opposed to it, to those that had been the most ardent advocates and supporters. And that language facilitates a remarkably rapid resolution process in the United Nations Security Council, Resolution 1973. And the power of the norm is indicated, I think, also in the fact that China and Russia, which really didn't like Resolution 1973, were not prepared to veto it, instead abstaining, as well as 3 others that abstained. At least 4 of those 5 that abstained would, without R2P, pre-R2P, I think, have actually voted against it. They didn't. But then when you get to implement it, immediately a fundamental dilemma comes up, and I think that is inherent to R2P. Can you provide effective protection to the civilians by restricting yourself to a no-fly zone and without incorporating regime change into your goals? But if you want to trip over into regime change, can you sustain the consensus in the Security Council? That is the dilemma, I think, that is going to haunt us. And that's the dilemma we face again in Syria. Because it's a different context for a number of reasons. Domestically, it's much more formidable an opponent. The political and sectarian situation is much more complicated between the Alawite Shias, the Sunnis, the Druze, the Christians. We know that there is substantial support for the Assad regime, we just don't know how much. It's a far more volatile and complex regional environment. And the consequences of getting it wrong will be far more drastic in the region. Not the least because of this, at least in the public debate in the West, underappreciated Sunni-Shia divide and how that feeds into the whole thing. I think that that's a major factor in that. What to do about Syria is not simply a question of Syria, it is also a question of relations with Iran and Russia and China. And China and Russia do have geopolitical and commercial interests at stake. But like most major powers, they also actually do have some principled issues at stake. And again, don't seem to get as much play as they should. They really don't like intrusions into sovereign affairs. They don't think the United Nations has any business imposing political settlements on internal power struggles. They think there is some distribution of responsibility for the violence between the government and the groups. Not necessarily equal, but there is some responsibility on the rebel groups as well. They are concerned very much so about the moral hazard argument. Do we really want to encourage rebel groups and oppositions and dissidents and wannabe secessionists everywhere in the world to take to arms, to intensify violence as a means of provoking international intervention to combat disproportionate use of force by the government? They question very strongly the idea that in today's world, anyone but the government has the right to use force. So there are some principled issues that they are concerned with. And when you mix that with the practical considerations, it becomes very difficult to find a way out of this that would assure us that the situation would not really be worse than it is. So in conclusion, I think the overall point is it's been a major normative advance. I think Libya was a successful, albeit controversial and contested application of the norm. But at the end of the day, R2P is no more self-guaranteeing than any other type of external intervention. It's not a magical formula by means of which good intentions can be translated into good policy outcomes in foreign lands. The risks of unintended and perverse consequences remain. There is no humanitarian crisis so grave that it cannot be made worse by an external military intervention. And therefore, the need for due diligence remains an imperative. On an informed assessment, are we reasonably confident of doing more good than harm? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we've got plenty shared by the panellists in a variety of different areas and with a variety of different concepts: contested normative advances, rethinking criminalisation processes, focusing on achievements, transgenerational challenges that we face, systemic crises. I said flippantly at the start that when we came to the discussion, the Q&A, that it was about solutions. This, of course, isn't. It is not about that at all. It's now an opportunity. We've got about 45 minutes for people to raise questions, but also to make any comments they want to do. And what I'd like to try to do is to get as many voices as possible from the audience. So rather than go question, answer, let's see if we can get some sort of discussion. So can I open the floor? Gail has a microphone there, and could you tell us who you are? And I'm going to look through the bright lights down upon us for hands. And I think there was somebody over there to start us. Please.
Thank you. Pami Aalto, University of Tampere, Finland. The panel has addressed very serious problems in a very excellent manner. Okay. Let me pick two. Global climate change, I think, was mentioned at least in Paul Rogers' presentation. Then debt and growth issue was mentioned in Colin Hayes' presentation. And my question to the panel is, and to all of us, Western advanced democracies are responsible to a large extent to these two problems. Is it possible that our electoral systems, the 4-year electoral cycle, is partly responsible for our inability to properly tackle those problems? And let me contrast that to some other time horizons. Some other actors that are also involved in these problems and that can tackle these problems are international corporations. Some of their time horizons are a quarter of a year. For some companies which operate with large infrastructure, time horizon can be 15 to 25 years. Electoral cycle, 4 years. Is this part of the problem, and can we find other solutions?
Thank you very much. Can I take another question or comment, please? Okay, right up here at the front. Owen.
Thank you. Owen Green, University of Bradford. Thanks very much for the presentations. There are so many questions to ask. Can I choose two? First of all, to Ramesh. When we were discussing R2P issues after the report and so on. I can recall a long conversation about the distinctiveness of respect for Security Council vetoes in the implementation of R2P. And I'd just like to pick up on this because that wasn't one of the criteria you particularly highlighted when coming to Syria. And it obviously relates very much to this issue of, clearly without UN Security Council proper mandate, then there are all sorts of negative consequences which have to be factored into the equation. The real issue is it a real veto, or is it just a factor to be taken into account? And I'd be very interested in your sort of reflections on this now. To Beth, on transnational crime, and a long interest of mine, I wonder whether you'd comment, because one of the most interesting features to me of a lot of the international responses to transnational crime, certainly in terms of combating it and the law enforcement dimension, is how extraordinarily fragmented it is. Although the networks interconnect in the way you talk about, and there are an awful lot of hotspots, when you actually look at the responses, you can find whole teams dealing with tobacco trafficking who are only focused on that and not joining up the dots. And I just wonder, there are multiple explanations for that. Some of them are just strictly bureaucratic. And I just wonder whether you have any reflections on this fragmentation of response. Each trafficking issue is often considered in its own right when it comes to the law enforcement side. Obviously not so much on the prevention side, but on the law enforcement side. So please, thanks.
Thank you. There's Theo Farrell as well. Can I just do that for a moment, because there's somebody there as well. So Theo first, and then we'll come to the back. Thank you.
Thanks. I thought I'd get my question in to save Gail running back and forth. And again, a question for Ramesh, and with regards to R2P. And understandably, we're looking at Libya and Syria, but if we look back a few years at Iraq, and what are the lessons of Iraq? And I'd like to suggest that perhaps Iraq has presented a profound challenge to R2P, politically, normatively, and operationally, both in terms of the humanitarian argument and the argument that was invoked in Kosovo, that the UN Security Council wasn't working, it wasn't doing its job, and so a coalition of the willing had to step up to the plate instead. And that suggests to me that there is a natural tension between R2P, between, as you put it, it's a mechanism for harnessing moral outrage, but international law has nothing to do with moral outrage. International law, in its classical legal positivism sense, is about what states say is legal. And so there's a natural tension between R2P and international law, and this argument about we have to step in up to the plate when the Security Council doesn't work is a challenge. But the other challenge at the back end of Iraq is looking back at what was achieved. And although the humanitarian argument wasn't really a credible one for the origins of the war, what was the effect of overthrowing this regime? And the most reliable casualty statistics, which is the Iraqi Family Health Working Group, where they reran the statistics from the Lancet project, put the human casualties at around about 151,000 civilians killed, excess deaths, and most of that through armed violence. And so it's what we're seeing now in Libya, which is the problems of stabilizing the country, is what we've seen in Afghanistan, the problems of, if we go in and try and replace the regime, or who picks up the pieces? How difficult is that? So I'd invite you to consider, to what extent are there still profound problems with R2P, which Iraq seemed to suggest. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. There's somebody right towards the back. You know, you're teaching a class and the lights are very, very bright and you can't see any faces. That's kind of where we are at the moment. So we'll come to you next. Thanks.
My name is Katerina Dalacour. I'm at the LSE. I want to ask Professor Thakur specifically about Libya in relation to Syria. Are the horrors in Syria that we're witnessing at the moment the result of Libya? What I mean by that is the reluctance of Russia at present to put pressure on the Assad regime the direct result of its considering itself, arguably, that's what I have read, of being tricked in the case of Libya, of being of allowing the resolution to go through. I think this raises a bigger question of with regards to responsibility to protect, which is similar to what Theo was perhaps suggesting just now, which is responsibility to protect whom and for how long. Thank you.
Thank you. Gail, if you can come to the the front first.
Hi, David Galbraith, University of Bath. My question is, two questions. Do we have a crisis in human development? If human development is the assumption that year after year more and more people will be better off, can we really make that assumption any longer? It's not morally bankrupt, it's just becoming increasingly impossible. And the second question is perhaps more provocative. Do we imagine that the end of a Chinese century will look better than the end of an American century?
Thank you. And then somebody here on this side, Gail, up front.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Sebastian Gehardt, and I'm from the University of Warwick. I have a question which is probably going to be mainly addressed at Colin Hay. I was sort of struck by the difference of the big challenges that Colin Hay raised in his presentation of the fundamental rethinking we need to do or to move beyond this crisis, and on the other hand, the big challenges that came out of Ramesh's presentation of responsibility to protect, how much of a challenge it is, even for a major organization like the UN, whatever its faults may be, to promote such a change in behavior, such a normative change in international relations. So I would ask the question back to Colin Hay, who could be the political actor? It doesn't have to be an international organization, but it could be one who would have sort of the means and the motives and the possibility to lead the sort of normative changes that you sort of advocate or would like to see in the way that the UN has tried to lead, for example, responsibility to protect. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I take maybe two more and then, sorry Gail, right to the back. See, this is a great plan, isn't it? Gail's worked about 300 hours in the last couple of weeks, so what do we do? We get her to run up and down, please.
Yeah, poor Gail. My name is Nicola Phillips. I'm at the University of Sheffield. I have two questions. Oh, well, a question and a comment, I think. The question's for Colin. Colin, you're talking about not a crisis, and I can't remember the exact phrase that you used, but it was about a catastrophe of the Anglo-American model. But yet we're still talking about it in Anglo-American terms. Or the question is, are we still talking about it in Anglo-American terms? You mentioned what was being talked about in the corridors of the IMF, World Bank, Elysee Palace, White House. Don't we need to be knowing what's being talked about in Beijing or in Brasilia, for instance? Don't we need to think about the future of the catastrophe in terms of what kinds of pressures, solutions perhaps might be coming from elsewhere in the global economy and not simply from within the Anglo-American model? It's a question. Do you think that there's more space than we customarily afford to those sorts of questions in discussions of how we're going to emerge, if we are going to emerge from the catastrophe and the avenues that we might seek for doing that. The comment, which might have a question in it by the time I get to the end of it, was seeking to link Beth's presentation with Paul's presentation. And I was wondering to what extent this focus on criminal law as a way of dealing with human trafficking is an example precisely of what Paul referred to as lidism, that if you focus on criminal law as the mechanism for dealing with it and criminality as the framework for understanding it, then you essentially relieve yourself of the obligation to address all of the underlying causes, which are essentially economic, particularly if we're talking about trafficking for labour exploitation. You don't need to take on the private sector and engage in the sorts of discussions that Colin opened up about how we can't rely on private solutions, or sorry, on the private sector to provide global public goods. We don't need to think about the ways in which particular kinds of global economic activity produce the kinds of marginalization that Paul was talking about. So is this idea of is the problem with the idea of criminalization not so much that it simply creates more crime, but that it allows us essentially to focus on the symptoms of the problems rather than the causes? Thank you.
Gail, predictably right at the front, having been right at the back.
Okay.
And can I just do this and see if anybody else wants at this stage to put their hand up? And if they do, please, thank you. And then after one more, we'll have some responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Aronson, University of Surrey. I hesitate to ask this question because I know I shall be misunderstood. So let me preface it by saying that I endorse everything that Ramesh Thakur said about R2P in terms of what it's trying to achieve. But I couldn't help thinking, as he talked about R2P, I couldn't help linking particularly the intervention in Libya with what both Paul and Beth were saying about Lidism. And really my question for the whole panel is the intervention in Libya not yet another example of Lidism? Despite the noble intent and purpose of R2P, but in terms of how it's actually implemented in that case with the consequences for Syria, but not just the consequences for Syria, really the way it was actually approached.
Thank you. And then just there, Gail, just behind you.
Jelica Stefanovic, Tambuk, University of Belgrade. I have two questions. One question is addressed to Ramesh Thakur. It's very similar to many voices already heard with the question, and I will put it this way. How can responsibility to protect can work without standards of accountability, or as Dilma Rousseff said, responsibility in protection? So the other part of that comes from the experience that the deflecting diplomats are not the best reliable source for information and for making strategies, never ever in history. And the second question is related to all. Can we think about diverse responses to existing challenges? There's probably different list of challenges. If we are not listening the voices in BRICS or in, for instance, Group for Global Governance, perhaps we can look somewhere into civil society groups and transnational movements. Probably 99% have some probable answers to certain of challenges. Where is the diversity in the discipline if we do not listen all these voices and list of challenges? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So at that point, I'm going to stop, I think. I can't see anybody else. And ask our panelists to respond, obviously, to those questions directly pointed to them, but also to have some freedom to range more broadly across a number of the other issues. And Beth, I wonder if you might start.
Sure, I'll start. Were offered up. And the first one wasn't to me, but I want to say something about it anyway. And that is the question about the problem of time horizons. And couldn't corporations do a lot better than governments because they don't have elections every 4 years? The way I know this crisis, banks had an awful lot of unreasonable lending that they engaged in and a lot of unreasonable practices. And so it seems to me that sort of the idea that corporations can make wiser decisions, and certainly the idea that they have sort of broader time horizons doesn't sort of register with what I know of this crisis or what I know about corporate activity, at least in much of the American context. I thought you were going to say something about China, how sort of if we could only have the time horizons of China, none of us would be in debt. The problem is China sold us all the stuff. And so, so American and I don't know to what extent Western European consumers in debt on the purchase of Chinese goods is, of course, part of the problem. And, sort of one possibility is to think about some kind of mutual adjustments that have to do both with the Chinese and with a consumer and producer, for example, lender and borrower, it seems to me. So I just wanted to say that. And then now to get a little bit more to some of the questions having to do with transnational crime, responses being too fragmented and not enough connecting of the dots. That's probably very true. The problem is we don't know what the dots look like even. This is part of the problem. It's not easy to get a fix on what the nature of the response has been to transnational crime because it's hard to sort of get into these records. But it seems to me that one trend that people haven't noticed is the proliferation of memoranda of understanding between police departments. And so there's this kind of effort very much ground up where the NYPD is dealing directly with police, its counterparts in other countries to try to deal with some of this. So the coordination has been very haphazard, and no one's got sort of a complete sort of view sort of bird's eye view of all these kinds of agreements. They're very difficult to collect all of them. Then there are mechanisms like Interpol and Europol, and they send out the red notices. So countries ask for assistance trying to arrest somebody. And Interpol is not going to disclose who sent in an arrest warrant request and who responded to it positively and who refused to respond to it. So there are some difficulties there. Actually, I've been talking with Interpol about what they can and can't tell us. Maybe there's hope in the future. And then I just wanted to say something, just a very quick answer to the question about can we all expect to be better off into the future? Actually, in the United States, we cannot. My children's generation is projected to be the first generation in which chronic health problems related to obesity may be expected to reduce life expectancy rather than to increase it. And I think that's just something to put out there. And then finally, the last one I wanted to respond to is criminal law to address human trafficking. Is it an example of litism and avoiding the real issues? Absolutely it is. But I want to be careful because I am also probably one of the people that would like to see someone go to jail who has exploited young persons, young women, girls, in a way that so clearly is abusive and exploitive. And they should go to jail. But I do think that it has some problems. While I'm sympathetic to that some of these, that some traffickers ought to be going to jail, I think that it does, in fact, avoid the root causes that you're talking about. And moreover, it seems to me there's a potential, a little bit of a dark side too, because sort of beefing up the borders, strengthening the borders, being scrutinizing in detail comings and goings can have severe implications, I think, for immigration policy as well. It can be turned to uses to which it was not intentionally developed. But let me just say one last thing on this. The criminalization approach, states like it. You can see why they like it. It empowers the state. It strengthens policing forces. It strengthens border protections. It creates capacity rather than creating obligations, whether they be developmental obligations or whether they be human rights obligations or anything else. So the criminalization approach has been almost necessary to achieving any international consensus to take serious action against human trafficking.
Thank you very much. Ramesh.
Thanks. Two quick comments on non-R2P question that's raised. First, our colleague from Tampere, let me remind you that in Australia and New Zealand, we actually have 3-year electoral cycles, not even 4-year, and that's a 1/3 extra from our point of view. But also, I think both there and elsewhere, within the same cycles, some administrations do demonstrate greater responsibility with a view to future-oriented decisions than others. So I'm not convinced in my own mind that it's a crisis of electoral democracy as opposed to a crisis of particular leaderships, and they're two different things. David, the Chinese century argument. The key thing to remember, I think, about China is that China, of course, has been a major power in the past. But unlike the European major powers, it doesn't have any literary, philosophical, or experiential tradition of operating as a major power in a system of major powers, as opposed to the Middle Kingdom. And it's been a fairly fast learning curve on both sides, having to adjust to China re-emerging and India re-emerging. I don't like emerging because that's historically, that's the aberration, that they have not been major powers. And we'll run into problems if we believe that they have no legitimate interests that need accommodation. We'll run into problems with Europeans, fair enough, but I think the other side is there as well. And they object to the phrase responsible stakeholders when what we mean by that is, if you are going to demonstrate responsibility, you will do as we tell you. That's a way that is fraught with problems in the future. On the R2P issues in the order in which they operate, and there are several major questions and comments that were there. Owen, on the veto, we did say in our report that on humanitarian atrocity issues, maybe the permanent members should abstain rather than veto. That was the position that Russia and China took. The difficulty again is, who is the country that has used the veto most often since the end of the Cold War? If they use it, it's the wrong kind of veto. If we use it, it's legitimate. Is there any prospect that any of the P5 will agree to give over the veto power? I doubt it. The most resistant, fiercely resistant, will be the United States. Now, of course, in theory, the logic was, with permanent membership and the veto clause, you're correlating power to responsibility, in that those who are going to be asked to implement should have the right to veto it. In logic, that remains not a bad thing. But it falls by the wayside if your permanent membership no longer correlates to the actual distribution of power equations. That is a problem. So I don't think the veto can be isolated from the increasingly out of misaligned Security Council. And if you think about it, you could in a sense solve the problem of legitimacy by expanding permanent membership to 10 and enlarging Security Council to 25, because 2 out of 5 is a hell of a lot more significant than 2 out of 10 permanent members. And 2 out of 15 is more significant than 2 out of 25. So contrary to conventional wisdom, I think we have much to gain by going and pushing for expansion. But of course, on that issue, again, not surprisingly, all P5 countries find common interest and common ground. So I think it's a more complex issue, but let's not again mistake the symptom for the underlying problems in that is there. Theo, Iraq is a very interesting example. Just for the sake of information, our commission was unusual in that 3 commissioners wrote the report themselves: Gareth Evans, Michael Ignatieff, and me. Of the 3, Michael went one way, all the other commissioners went the other way on Iraq. Stuart mentioned that I write for the newspapers. Both Gareth and I wrote at the time, before the Iraq was started, but while the debate was on, that we didn't think that satisfied our criteria for responsibility to protect. We were very clear in our mind. And I think the long-term effect was twofold, or the impact of Iraq for us was twofold. In the first instance, as they couldn't find these elusive weapons of mass destruction, wouldn't it be nice for an American administration to say the United Nations was right? They did disarm Saddam Hussein? We're still waiting, but never mind. As that argument fell by the wayside and other arguments about links to Al-Qaeda and 9/11 were discredited, the only remaining justification was the humanitarian intervention one. So they started using that language. Short term, therefore, we suffered a major problem. But then, because Michael had identified with that, he no longer took part in the dissemination of the commission work. And essentially, it was Gareth, me, and Tom Bies. Gareth speaking primarily to policy audiences. I spoke to both policy and academic, and Tom Bies mainly to the academic audiences. So from the commission directly, it was Gareth and me who did the thing, and I was dealing with it worldwide on that basis as well. And we made the argument, look, if we had the responsibility to protect, A, it increases pressures on those who don't want to intervene when the circumstances are justified. And B, it makes it more difficult for them to misappropriate the language when it isn't justified. And that it would have been more difficult to go into Iraq if we had had this endorsed, because they wouldn't have met the criteria. Over time, I think that argument began to resonate, and it worked to our advantage in that sense, because no one bought that linkage, no one outside the very few countries concerned. So I think that did work to our advantage. The question of law, I agree. In another paper I did, I said, you can discuss R2P in terms of discursive, conceptual advance, policy template, and legal obligations. No one, to my knowledge, anywhere, has claimed that it has reached the stage of imposing legal obligations. So that's not there. It's a political factor, and it's a contingency, case-by-case issue that will be there as well. The question of, is Syria the result of Libya? In more ways than one. I think, the Arab Spring phenomenon, after all, there have been connections from one to the other as well. The Chinese and the Russians have been very explicit in saying, in their view, Resolution 1973 was overstretched, overextended. I think the dilemma that the NATO countries faced, or the countries involved faced, was genuine, but they've sort of retreated into political and legal sophistry in justifying that rather than arguing the case for it and showing that there were significant difficulties. In response, the most interesting count, and by the way, that's not limited to China and Russia, Brazil and India, and even South Africa, which voted for it after all, feel very strongly on that issue, and so does the African Union more broadly. But the most interesting response and the most constructive response came from the Brazilians while they're still on the Security Council, presenting a paper, Responsibility While Protecting. Many rough parts to that, but the two key items that I think will form the debate as we go forward. One, and debate on conditions before you go in on various issues. And two, a debate on accountability and oversight by the Security Council when you implement. Because what it showed was a divorce between those who had authorized and those who implemented, with no sense of accountability from one to the other. That issue, I think, is going to be a live political agenda issue in the Security Council. I know it is, and we'll come back. I hope we'll resolve that one way or the other. It goes back to what we had advocated as legitimacy criteria, which didn't get through in 2005. That was a mistake. I think they realize that now. They will come to that initially. I don't see how we'll ever get to the stage where the international community can accept that if the Security Council is deadlocked, you can take action on your own. Because let's be very blunt and very clear. What that means in practice is that the president of the day in Washington has the right to decide who is going to be which country's leader at any given time. You think we're going to accept that in the rest of the world? Excuse me. The world ain't like that, and the world is changing, and that power is gone. And to our colleague from Belgrade University, I think the responsibility while protecting gets back exactly to that issue, that there has to be accountability, there has to be some explanation, and there have to be some conditions put on when you authorize. This was the standard language we've used for 6.5 decades, all necessary means. It was abused. It was overextended. No question in my mind. And when they stand up and deny that, they just enrage their critics and get their backs up. That's not a way to get continued cooperation and consensus.
Just before you finish, there was the troubling question over here of Libya and Lidism. Mike's comment.
I think those who use the phrase Lidism might respond to that better, but it's something I've been struggling with as we go on in the evening. But I think, the reality is the Arab awakening. I think the intellectual roots and foundations of that go back to the United Nations Arab Human Development Report in 2004. And suddenly they decide to take ownership. The Arab world is no more monolithic than is the Western world or the Asian world or the African world. There will be different scenarios played out, but essentially they deserve the right to have local ownership. Again and again, we in the West, when we talk the language of local ownership, in practice mean we want you to have local ownership, but on our terms. Well, the real world is messy, untidy. It's not a linear movement in history. There will be problems. I think we all caught unawares by that. But when the people decide to take their destiny on their own hands, at great risks to themselves, and they ask for help and can be given some help, I'm happy for us to do that with the due diligence I was talking about. If we try to reassert control and retreat into Lidism, I think we'll continue to have problems down the line. They have to find their own destiny. They have the right to make their own mistakes and learn by their trial and error. They'll get there. I mean, you go back to the theories of the time. Who really predicted that X years down the line, India would still be a functioning democracy? It's worked. Messy, muddling through, where the British thought we learned better. We muddled through as well.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you. Thank you all for some very difficult questions. And in a sense, I now appreciate the problem, which was that I responded to the challenge of talking about challenges. Stuart encouraged you to think about solutions, and so you pose all those questions about solutions back to us, which is fine and fair enough and sort of touche and all the rest of it. But now it's probably important that I try and do what I can. The problem in a way is if I had the answers to the questions you just posed me, then they probably would have been in the presentation. And I mean, in a sense, my argument is to say these are the things that we need to think about, and hopefully in the process of thinking about them collectively, we might generate some of these solutions. Okay, but let me not be quite so evasive and to deal with some of the specific points made. I'm going to take Nicola Phillips' one first. Do I lavish too much attention on Anglo-liberal discourse, as it were? Yes, but I think there's a justification for that, and that's because, in a sense, I'm trying to characterize what's wrong. I'm trying to understand the problem, and that is the problem as I see it. Now, I'm not, I mean, and that means that if one's to start to move from the challenge to the solutions, one, of course, has to look at a welter of competing and alternative conceptions and discourses. But I'm not sure it's simply a question of changing the kind of geographical composition of the discourses one allows into the frame of reference here. Though of course it matters and will matter absolutely crucially what is thought outside of the Anglo-liberal enclave, as it were. But my point in a way is that the existing institutions we have at a transnational level think Anglo-liberal. And their capacity to think Anglo-liberal has been reinforced rather than undermined. There have been various points in this process in which it's looked like it might be different, and there are some soft spots, even in the Anglo-liberal discourse, which I think can be sort of punctured or massaged or whatever one does to them to... Yeah, massages probably would make them better, wouldn't it? So it's probably not massage them, but whatever. We can sort of probe them in some kind of ways which might create some space. But I think ultimately we have to see those transnational institutions that we have as enthralled to a discourse which is part of the problem. And that I think is your point, and it's a point that I would very much want to make too. That brings me on to the sort of second set of challenges and concerns, which are really about whether we have any transnational or international carriers for the kind of alternative set of economic ideas that we might be talking about here. That's a very, very good question. Sadly, it's not one about which I can be terribly optimistic, I think. I mean, part of the solution is the sort of the Nicola Phillips comment, which is we need to broaden the frame of reference here and see what we've got. And I'm not in a position to review the full range of the discourses we have available to us. And there are some interesting and intriguing ideas out there that could be brought into the equation. But the point is actually about institutional capacity. And what I'm struck by, in a sense, is that, I mean, there's no equivalent discourse to the R2P discourse at a transnational level in terms of economic policy formation at all. We don't have a capacity to talk about collective public goods, economic collective public goods internationally whatsoever. Insofar as we have a notion of a collective economic public good, it's the market, it strikes me. And that strikes me as a rather problematic conception for pretty obvious reasons at this particular moment in time. So I'm rather skeptical about the existence of, I mean, already existing institutions which might do this. But I think it's actually a more procedural kind of a point in a sense. I think what we need to do is develop a kind of deliberative capacity at a transnational level, in a sense, to have the kind of conversation about what is it that we want to value. And I don't think that can be, that's not a question which can be answered by an academic. You can ask me what I would like to see as value, but I think much more important is what the world would like to see value, and what's the mechanism for aggregating those preferences and building institutions around those. That's a very difficult set of issues. I mean, of course, there are massive debates in international relations theory about how one can have those kind of, or design those kinds of institutions and think about collective public goods in that kind of a way. And my suggestion, in a sense, is that we try to draw more of that debate into our thinking about things like solutions to the crisis. So it's not so much an answer to your question as a sort of suggestion of where we might look to try to do a little bit more of that. And the other question I really wanted to talk about briefly is the electoral cycle ones. I mean, Ramesh talked about this, and my response is broadly similar. Domestic electoral cycles are very important, and they're very limiting in some sense. It's very easy. It's increasingly difficult, actually, but it's easy in some sense for timid politicians to avoid taking tough decisions on long-term issues which will post-date them, in a sense, and we all know that. That said, it's not the only problem and it's not the principal problem. There may be a sort of a kind of temporality problem, a temporality disjuncture, if you like. The temporality of domestic electoral politics makes dealing with long-term environmental degradation or designing a new growth model for the British economy too difficult to deal with because they can't be dealt with in the short term, in a way. But that's not the only issue. There's also a sort of a levels problem, which is that our politics, our politicians in some sense, or politicians tend to have whatever legitimacy they have, principally achieved at a domestic level. And we've yet to design institutions which are capable, it strikes me, of carrying much transnational legitimacy, and we need to think about that because that's integral to dealing with these issues. Final point would be on this, again, that it does strike me that there is a very interesting intergenerational electoral politics which may be emerging and is likely to be reinforced. So it strikes me that electoral politics, even limited to its 4-year, 5-year, 3-year, whatever cycles, is not immune to intergenerational long-term considerations. And the politicization of intergenerational transfers strikes me as something which, even in Britain, political parties toy with in a sense. Miliband made an early speech and talked about the betrayal of the intergenerational contract. It's rather drifted away from the agenda, but I think it's not difficult to see how it might be brought back and how it's been brought back in other polities too. And that, it strikes me, is one way in which these kinds of issues can indeed become embedded and contested domestically and politically.
Colin, thanks. Paul, before we come to you, Ramesh just wants to have one quick response to what Colin's just said.
Yeah, the comment about there is no equivalent to the R2P discourse, I think there is beginning to be an incipient parallel thing, and the common theme is redefinition of sovereignty as responsibility. If your actions within your sovereign jurisdiction have extraterritorial systemic consequences, then you must subject your regulatory surveillance instruments to international peer review mechanisms and monitoring and oversight. That hiding behind claims of sovereignty is no longer enough. And this must be done no matter how powerful or big you are. That debate is starting in policy circles, and it is in that line of sovereignty as responsibility.
Can I just very, very briefly on that? I absolutely agree. And actually one of the points that I had wanted to make was that I think we should explore rather more the parallels between R2P and the process in and through which it came to be what it came to be, and assess the implications of that for thinking about what transnational economic governance and holding globalization to account might mean economically, in a sense. I think you're right that there are some principles there which could easily be transmuted or transliterated into an economic discourse, and may even be so in a sort of proto-economic governance discourse. But I think we need to reinforce that tendency. And actually, there's one other point I wanted to make, just very, very briefly, which is that it's about moving beyond Liddism, if we're going to call it that. And it does strike me, it's just a one-liner, but post-Liddism requires an awful lot of intellectual work. Because it's inherently difficult. That's, I think, what we've all been saying, actually, and in some sense, that's a pitch to us all as a community, I think, because actually some of that work needs to be done by the kind of stuff that we do.
Thank you. Paul.
I very much endorse Colin's final comments there. I'll just take maybe 3 issues. First, going back, I think, to the first question on timescales. Yes, there are obviously problems with relative short-termism in politics, but I very much agree with what Beth was saying. If you look at the other side of it, take, for example, the financial problems. These developed in the middle 2000s with the toxic loans, primarily, but not only in the United States. You had them bundled up into credit default swaps and then into even larger bundles of collateral debt obligations, which became unsustainable. And you had a crunch involving Lehman, Northern Rock and the rest, and then basically the partial nationalization of a number of banks to save them. But if you look at what was going on, it's a combination of 4 things. There was a real hubris in the financial system. It believed that it was in a period of indefinite growth. It was not subject to proper regulation. And then finally, you had the quants, the technical people who believed that their econometric systems could actually predict successfully. You put all those together, and that is essentially what left us into the kind of mess we had. So I think that is one way of looking at the possibility of, if you like, the market economy, the financial systems leading us out of the problems. It's also the case that in spite of short-term electoral cycles, you can get politicians with a sense of vision. But the reality is that Schuman and Monnet and others, 50, 60 years ago, were about preventing a third European civil war. Whether you agree or not with what the EU has developed into, that was a lot of their thinking at the start. And you can get that long-term thinking, and it can be helped by developments in civil society. On the issue of Libya, just a small point here, I don't want to get into the controversies, but it is worth remembering that 4 months before the fighting started, before NATO started intervening, a London-based British company was organizing a major arms fair in Tripoli. 3 or 4 days before the French, Italians, British and Americans started the bombing, there was a French government-owned arms company upgrading the Libyan F-1 Mirage strike aircraft, and Finmeccanica, the biggest Italian arms company, was actually working on upgrading the Libyan army's armored personnel carriers. So in other words, there was a very, very quick change, and that is not unnoticed across many of the parts of the world. I suppose the final thing, really, let me put it in this way, a nice little joke from years past. It used to be said in the days of the British Empire that the sun never set on the British Empire. I remember a Ghanaian friend saying to me 40 years ago, he said, well, we always knew there's very good reason for that, Paul. I said, what was that? He said, it's because God didn't trust the British in the dark. Now, in that little joke, you have encapsulated 2 completely different views of the world. Tell that joke in 1890s Victorian London, you would be met with blank stares, because basically Britain was Pax Britannica civilizing the world. Now, I'm not in the hair shirt brigade, but I suppose what I would say is that there's an assumption that we, if you like, in the Atlantic community, are the good guys. Now, I use the term guy because there's certainly a gendered element to this. The reality is we're not. We're not necessarily the bad guys. We're more or less the same as everybody else. And incidentally, it's worth remembering that the combined populations from which the ISA and BISA primarily drawing their membership, the United States and Britain, represent barely 5% of the world's population. So I suppose it's really a question of a certain degree of modesty as we go forward, and I think very much recognition that views vary hugely across the world, and even beyond the elites, which tend to take, if you like, the Atlantic view of the world. And I think breaking that down is important. I think that is one of the most important roles, in fact, for the discipline of international relations.
Paul, thanks very much for those comments. Well, that brings an end to this part of the activity, but not an end to the evening, because we'd like to invite you all, please, downstairs for a wine reception where we can continue to discuss a number of these sorts of things over 1 or 2, 3, or more glasses of wine. But before we do, could I invite you all, please, to thank our fantastic panel in the usual way. Thank you all very much.